Welcome. You're standing in Asheville, North Carolina in 1895, and you're looking at the largest private residence ever built in America. Biltmore House rises from the Blue Ridge Mountains like a chateau transplanted from the Loire Valley. 175,000 square feet, 250 rooms, 4 acres of floor space under one roof. This is not a house. This is a statement. George Washington Vanderbilt II built this at age 33 with inherited railroad money. And what he built was the physical manifestation of Gilded Age ambition, European fantasy, and American excess combined into something that shouldn't exist but does. The house cost approximately $6 million to build, equivalent to roughly $200 million today. But the real cost was higher, measured in labor, in displacement, in the creation of a private world so complete it required a village to sustain it. This is Biltmore, and it was obsolete before it was finished. The Vanderbilt family begins with Cornelius Vanderbilt, born 1794, died 1877. He started with nothing, a ferry boat on Staten Island. He built a shipping empire, then a railroad empire. When he died, he was worth $105 million, the richest American who had ever lived. In today's money, adjusted for GDP, that's approximately $230 billion. More than Jeff Bezos, more than Elon Musk. Vanderbilt wealth was generational, foundational, transformative. But Cornelius was brutal. He believed in primogeniture. Almost everything went to his eldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt. The other children received comparatively little. William doubled the fortune in 8 years. When he died in 1885, he was worth $200 million, the richest man in the world. He divided it more evenly among his children. George Washington Vanderbilt II was his youngest son. George inherited roughly $10 million outright, plus income from trust funds. This was his starting point. He never worked, he never needed to. He was born into wealth so vast that spending it required deliberate effort. George was different from his brothers. The other Vanderbilts built mansions in Newport, palaces on Fifth Avenue, competed in displays of wealth, married into European aristocracy, threw parties that became legend. George was quiet, scholarly, bookish. He collected rare books and art. He spoke 8 languages. He traveled constantly through Europe, studying architecture, absorbing culture. He never married young. He avoided society. What he wanted was something private, a retreat, a place removed from New York, from the family competition, from the public gaze. In 1888, at age 26, he visited Asheville. The mountains attracted him. The climate was mild. The area was undeveloped. Land was cheap. He started buying. He bought 2,000 acres, then 10,000, then 50,000, eventually 125,000 acres, nearly 200 square miles. An area larger than many American cities. He wasn't building a house. He was building a private country. The architect was Richard Morris Hunt, 65 years old, the Dean of American Architecture, designer of the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty, creator of multiple Vanderbilt mansions in Newport and New York. Hunt was the first American to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He brought European classicism to American wealth. George wanted a chateau. Hunt gave him one. The design was based on 3 French Renaissance chateaux, Blois, Chenonceau, and Chambord. The house was asymmetrical, which was unusual for American mansion design. Towers at different heights, roof lines that varied, dormers, spires, gargoyles, carved limestone. The exterior was Indiana limestone, shipped by rail at enormous expense. The roof was slate, also shipped from distant quarries. Every material was imported. Nothing local was good enough. The landscape architect was Frederick Law Olmsted, designer of Central Park, the most famous landscape architect in America. Olmsted was 66 when George hired him. He saw Biltmore as his final masterpiece. George had shown him the land, raw and mostly deforested from logging. Olmsted told him the land was ruined. The soil was exhausted. Building a decorative estate here would be folly. Instead, Olmsted proposed something unprecedented, a planned forest, reforestation on a massive scale, scientific forestry, the creation of a managed woodland that could sustain itself and demonstrate conservation principles. George agreed. This was the vision, a house in the middle of a restored forest, a private paradise created from wasteland. Construction began in 1889. It took 6 years. At the peak, over 1,000 workers were on site. Stonemasons, carpenters, plasterers, craftsmen brought from Europe. A private railroad spur was built to bring materials directly to the construction site. Bricks were fired on site in kilns built specifically for the project. A brick factory, a woodworking mill, a private power plant. The infrastructure required to build Biltmore was itself a small industrial operation. The workers lived in a temporary village. Biltmore Village, later permanent, was initially housing for construction workers. George built it in the English cottage style. Picturesque, planned. He controlled the architecture, the layout, the aesthetics. Even the workers' housing had to match his vision. The house that emerged was staggering. 4 stories above ground, 2 below. The basement contained the mechanical systems: heating, electrical, plumbing, kitchens, storage. Biltmore was among the first private homes in America with electricity throughout. Central heating, hot and cold running water in every bathroom, refrigeration, fire alarms, mechanical ventilation. The technology was cutting edge. The banquet hall was 72 feet long with a 70-foot ceiling. A triple fireplace dominated one end. The table could seat 64. The organ loft held a pipe organ. Tapestries covered the walls. The ceiling was barrel vaulted. This room alone was larger than most houses. It was used rarely. Christmas, special occasions. Most of the time it sat empty. The library held 10,000 volumes in George's collection, later expanded to 23,000. First editions, rare manuscripts, books in multiple languages, a ceiling painted by the Italian artist Giovanni Antonio Pellegrini, removed from a Venetian palace and installed here. The walls were black walnut. The room smelled of leather and old paper. George spent most of his time here, reading, studying. This was his actual home. The rest of the house was display. The winter garden was an indoor conservatory with a glass roof. Palm trees grew inside the house. Orchids, ferns, a fountain in the center. The temperature was controlled, even in winter. This room was tropical. The excess was quiet but total. Growing palm trees in North Carolina required engineering, constant maintenance, imported soil, specialized staff. It was nature made artificial, then brought indoors. There were 43 bathrooms, each one different. Marble, tile, custom fixtures. Hot water was available instantly, a luxury almost unknown in 1895. Most Americans didn't have indoor plumbing at all. Biltmore had dozens of bathtubs. The servants' quarters were spacious by the standards of the day. Still servants' quarters, still a different world from the family rooms, but relatively comfortable. George believed in treating staff well. He paid better than average. He provided housing, meals, medical care. This wasn't altruism, it was practicality. A house this size required loyal, skilled staff. You couldn't run Biltmore with resentful employees. The estate required a permanent staff of 40 to 60 people just to maintain it. Housemaids, footmen, cooks, laundresses, butlers, chauffeurs, grooms, gardeners, foresters, farm workers. Each person had a specific role. The hierarchy was rigid. The head butler managed the male staff. The housekeeper managed the female staff. They answered to George, later to his wife. The servants lived in the house or in estate housing. They had schedules, uniforms, rules. No mixing between male and female staff. No unauthorized visitors. No deviation from routine. The grandeur of Biltmore depended entirely on invisible labor. Guests saw the house gleaming, the grounds perfect, the meals appearing magically. They didn't see the 4 a.m. wake-up calls for kitchen staff, the endless polishing of silver, the hauling of coal for fireplaces, the scrubbing of floors. The house was a machine, and the servants were the parts that made it function. George opened the house on Christmas Eve, 1895. It wasn't finished. Parts of the interior were incomplete. Some rooms were unfurnished. But Christmas was the deadline, and George met it. The first guests were family, his mother, his sisters, a few close friends. They arrived by train to Biltmore Station, built specifically for the estate. Carriages brought them up the 3-mile approach road through the forest Olmsted was planting. The house appeared gradually, first glimpses through trees, then the full reveal as the road curved. The reaction was uniformly shocked. It was too big, too much, too European, too impossible. But it was real, and it was George's. The estate became George's life. He managed the forest personally, working with Gifford Pinchot, the first American trained in scientific forestry. Pinchot surveyed the land, developed a management plan, demonstrated that forests could be harvested sustainably. This was revolutionary. American forestry in the 1890s was extraction, cut everything, move on. Pinchot and George proved another model was possible. The Biltmore Forest School, established in 1898, was the first forestry school in America. It trained a generation of foresters. The principles developed here influenced national forest policy. Theodore Roosevelt, who visited Biltmore, absorbed these ideas. The conservation movement in America has roots in George Vanderbilt's private estate. This wasn't the intent. George wanted a well-managed property. The broader impact was accidental. The estate was self-sustaining in some ways. Dairy farm, vegetable gardens, orchards, livestock. The production fed the house and the staff. Surplus was sold locally. George wasn't trying to make money. He was trying to create a complete, controlled environment. The farms were experimental, new techniques, imported breeds, scientific agriculture. Again, the broader influence was unintended. Local farmers saw what worked at Biltmore and adopted the methods. The estate became an agricultural model, but the finances were unsustainable. George had inherited roughly $10 million. Biltmore cost $6 million to build. Maintaining it cost between $250,000 and $300,000 annually. His income from investments was substantial, but Biltmore consumed it. He wasn't building wealth. He was spending it. The house was a money furnace. Every year, the fortune shrank. George didn't seem concerned. He had enough. The estate gave him purpose. He expanded the art collection, bought more books, improved the farms, extended the forests. He was building a legacy, though he didn't call it that. In 1898, at age 36, George married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser. She was 25, from a prominent but not wealthy family, educated, traveled. She spoke French fluently. She fit into George's world. The marriage was happy by accounts. They had one child, Cornelia, born in 1900. The birth was difficult. Edith nearly died. There were no more children. Cornelia grew up in Biltmore, an only child in a 250-room house. She had tutors, servants, everything she wanted materially. But she was isolated, no neighbors, no nearby children. The estate was her entire world. When she was old enough, she was sent to boarding school, then to Europe, then back to Biltmore. Her life was shaped entirely by the house. George died in 1914 at age 51, complications from emergency appendix surgery in Washington, D.C. Unexpected, sudden, he left everything to Edith, the estate, the house, the debt. Because by 1914, there was debt. George had been selling land to pay expenses. The 125,000 acres were down to 100,000. Edith inherited a magnificent estate and a financial crisis. She was 41. Cornelia was 14. Edith had to decide what to do with Biltmore. She could have sold it. Developers would have bought the land. The house could have been demolished or converted. But Edith understood what George built. She kept it. She sold more land, 87,000 acres, to the federal government. It became the core of Pisgah National Forest. This sale funded the estate's operation. Edith reduced staff, cut expenses, closed parts of the house. During World War I, she opened Biltmore to convalescing soldiers. The house became a recovery hospital. Soldiers walked the grounds, sat in the gardens, recovered in rooms designed for Vanderbilt guests. The juxtaposition was surreal. Men from working-class backgrounds, wounded in Europe, resting in a chateau in North Carolina. The war changed everything. The world that created Biltmore was gone. The Gilded Age had ended. After the war, Edith reopened the house for private use, but smaller, fewer guests, less extravagance. The 1920s were strange for Biltmore. The house was outdated, a relic of pre-war excess, but it still stood. Cornelia married in 1924 to John Francis Amherst Cecil, a British aristocrat. The wedding was at Biltmore. Enormous. the last great Biltmore event in the old style. Cornelia and John lived in the house, managing the estate. They had two sons, George and William. The boys grew up at Biltmore in the 1930s during the Depression. The contrast was stark. Outside the estate, unemployment, poverty, collapse. Inside, a chateau with 250 rooms. Edith tried opening the house to tourists in the 1930s. Tentatively, a few rooms, guided tours. The revenue helped. People were curious. The house was famous even if most Americans had never seen anything like it. But tourism wasn't enough. The estate struggled financially through the Depression and World War II. Edith died in 1958. Cornelia had left the estate years earlier, separated from her husband, living elsewhere. The house passed to her sons, George Cecil and William Cecil. They inherited the problem their great-grandfather created, a house too big to maintain, too important to abandon. William Cecil, the younger son, took control in 1960. He was 34, Harvard-educated. He understood business. He saw Biltmore clearly. It was a tourist attraction that wasn't being run as one. He professionalized it, expanded the tours, marketed aggressively, restored rooms, opened more of the house, created events. Christmas at Biltmore became an annual tradition. The house was decorated elaborately. Thousands of visitors came. The estate became a business, a successful one. By the 1970s, Biltmore was profitable for the first time since George built it. William kept expanding: winery, hotels, restaurants, shops. The estate became a destination, not just the house, but the entire experience. You could stay overnight in estate accommodations, eat in estate restaurants, buy estate wine. The commercialization was total, but it was also necessary. Without tourism revenue, the house couldn't survive. The choice was simple: turn Biltmore into a business or watch it decay. Today, Biltmore receives over 1 million visitors annually. It's one of the most visited historic houses in America. The tours are efficient. Groups move through rooms on schedule. Guides recite facts. The house is preserved meticulously. Furnishings are authentic or period appropriate. The gardens Olmsted designed are maintained. The forests are still managed. But the experience is curated, sanitized. You see the banquet hall and imagine parties, but you don't imagine the servants who cleaned it. You see the bedrooms and think luxury, but you don't think about the coal that had to be hauled to heat them. The house is presented as achievement, not as the product of a specific economic system that created vast wealth for a few and subsistence for many. The Vanderbilt wealth that built Biltmore came from railroads. Cornelius Vanderbilt built his fortune by controlling transportation, monopolies, rate manipulation, labor suppression, the strikes, the violence. The political corruption required to maintain railroad empires are not part of the Biltmore story as told to tourists. George Vanderbilt is presented as a gentleman scholar, which he was, but his money came from a system built on extraction. He didn't create that system, but he benefited from it absolutely. The workers who built Biltmore were paid wages, but the wages were low. They worked 6 days a week, 10 to 12-hour days. Dangerous conditions, stonework, carpentry, masonry, all carried risks. Injuries were common. Deaths occurred, though records are incomplete. The workers' village was temporary. When construction ended, most workers left. They had built something extraordinary, but they didn't own it. They couldn't afford to visit once it became a tourist site. Their labor created the house, but the house wasn't for them. The servants who maintained Biltmore lived better than many Americans in the 1890s and early 1900s. They had housing, food, security, but they had no freedom. They worked when told. They lived where told. They followed rules that governed every aspect of their lives. The upstairs-downstairs division was absolute. Servants used separate staircases. They ate separately. They were invisible when family or guests were present. The system worked because everyone accepted their role. The acceptance wasn't always willing. It was economic. You worked at Biltmore or you worked somewhere worse. The choice wasn't freedom versus servitude. It was better servitude versus worse. The forest conservation that George pioneered was genuine and forward-thinking, but it was possible only because he owned 125,000 acres. He could afford to manage forests sustainably because he didn't need immediate profit. For loggers working the same mountains, sustainability was irrelevant. They needed income now. They cut everything. George's conservation was enabled by wealth. The principles were sound, but the application required resources most people didn't have. Biltmore today is owned by the Cecil family, George's descendants. It's privately held, not a museum, not a public trust, a family business. Profitable, well-run. The estate generates revenue from tourism, hospitality, wine sales, retail. The family maintains control over operations, development, presentation. They've made decisions that preserve the house while commercializing the experience. The winery, opened in 1985, is the most visited winery in America. The wine is decent, not exceptional. People buy it because they visited Biltmore. The brand is the house. The house itself is maintained obsessively. A staff of conservators, curators, maintenance workers, groundskeepers keeps everything perfect, or as perfect as possible. A house this size is always deteriorating somewhere. Roofs leak, stone erodes, wood rots, paint fades. The maintenance is endless and expensive. Tourism revenue funds it. The cycle is self-sustaining as long as people keep visiting, and they do, because Biltmore offers something rare, a complete Gilded Age estate, intact, open to the public. You can walk through rooms George walked through, see his books, his art, his vision made physical. But what you can't see is what it cost. Not the $6 million in construction, the human cost, the workers who built it, the servants who maintained it, the system that made it possible, the inequality that was assumed to be natural. Biltmore exists because one man had more money than he could spend, and he chose to spend it on a house that required a village to sustain. The house is beautiful. The achievement is remarkable. The principle is disturbing. The Gilded Age produced many houses like Biltmore, though none as large. Newport was full of them. Fifth Avenue in New York, Long Island, most are gone now, demolished for development, too expensive to maintain, too outdated for modern use. Biltmore survived because it became a business. The family found a way to monetize their heritage. The house is a product, the history is a product, the experience is a product. This isn't criticism, it's observation. Without commercialization, Biltmore would be ruins. Walk through Biltmore today and you walk through a ghost of a world that no longer exists. The wealth that built it still exists, in different forms, different hands. But the specific expression of that wealth, the private chateau, the managed forest, the self-sustaining estate, that's gone. Tax policy changed. Labor laws changed. Social attitudes changed. Building Biltmore today would be illegal in some ways, impossible in others. Zoning laws, environmental regulations, labor standards, all would prevent it, and even if it were legal, it would be absurd. No one needs 250 rooms. No one needs 43 bathrooms. The house is a monument to a specific moment when wealth was concentrated enough and social acceptance permissive enough that someone could build this. George Vanderbilt was not a villain. By the standards of his class, he was enlightened. He treated workers relatively well. He pioneered conservation. He appreciated art and learning. He avoided the vulgar displays of his siblings. He built something he believed was beautiful and important. But he built it with inherited wealth, extracted from a system that created immense inequality. He lived in a house that required dozens of servants while millions of Americans lived in tenements. The contradiction didn't seem to trouble him. It was the natural order. He was born into wealth. Others were born into poverty. This was simply how the world was. The tourists who visit today don't think about this. They think about the beauty, the scale, the achievement. They take pictures. They buy wine. They eat at the estate restaurants. They enjoy the experience. Biltmore has been transformed from a private residence into a public spectacle. The transformation is complete and irreversible. The house that George built for privacy is now one of the most visited houses in America. Thousands of strangers walk through his bedroom, his library, his private spaces every day. The irony is total, but the house survives. That's something. Most Gilded Age mansions are gone. Biltmore remains because the family found a way to preserve it by sharing it. The price of survival is public access. The price of access is commercialization. The price of commercialization is the loss of the original purpose. George built Biltmore as a retreat. It became a museum. He wanted privacy. It became a tourist destination. He created a private world. It became a public product. The estate still covers 8,000 acres, smaller than George's 125,000, but still substantial. The forests are managed, the gardens are maintained. The house stands. Inside, the rooms are exactly as they were, or close enough. The library still holds books. The banquet hall still echoes. The winter garden still has palm trees. The illusion is maintained. You can imagine George walking these halls, reading in the library, hosting dinners in the banquet hall. The imagination is encouraged. It's part of the experience. What you can't imagine, what the tour doesn't emphasize, is the morning in 1889 when construction began. The raw land, the workers arriving, the limestone being unloaded from rail cars, the years of labor, the accidents, the exhaustion, the wealth being transformed into walls, floors, ceilings, decoration. The creation of something that shouldn't exist but does because one man had the money and the will and the vision. Biltmore is the last great American chateau. Nothing like it was built before. Nothing like it was built after. It's unique, a singularity, the peak and the end of Gilded Age domestic architecture. George built it at the exact moment when such things were still possible, just before the world changed in ways that made them impossible. He died in 1914. The First World War started that year. The old world ended. Biltmore survived into the new world, but as a relic, a beautiful, impossible, unsustainable relic that became sustainable only by ceasing to be private. This is what remains: a house, a business, a monument, a question. What does it mean that this exists? What does it mean that we preserve it, visit it, admire it? What does it mean that the system that created it is gone, but the house remains? The answers aren't simple. Biltmore is beautiful and disturbing, an achievement and a monument to inequality, a preservation success and a commercial product. It's all of these things at once. The forests George planted are mature now. The trees Olmsted designed are 130 years old. They've outlived George, Edith, Cornelia, everyone who knew the house when it was truly private. The house outlasted them too. It will outlast the current generation. It will probably outlast the next. Stone and steel and wood, properly maintained, can last centuries. The question isn't whether Biltmore will survive. The question is what it means when it does. George Washington Vanderbilt II built the largest house in America because he could, because he had the money and the land and the vision and the time. He built it for himself, for privacy, for beauty, for a retreat from the world. What he built became the opposite: a public attraction, a business, a symbol of an era. The transformation happened gradually, then all at once. And now, 130 years later, over 1 million people a year walk through his private chateau. And the house that was meant to be a retreat from the world has become a destination for the world. This is Biltmore. Not the tour, not the brand, but the reality. An impossible house that shouldn't exist but does. Built by wealth extracted from railroads, maintained by invisible labor, transformed into a business, preserved as a monument, beautiful and excessive and problematic and real. It stands in the Blue Ridge Mountains, 4 acres of floor space under one roof, 250 rooms, 43 bathrooms, a complete world created by one man's inherited fortune. And it remains, long after the world that created it has vanished, a ghost made of limestone and slate and expensive imported materials, open for tours, daily, year-round, admission charged.